Hi, everyone. Welcome to Data Ethics Professional webinar number 12. Today, we are joined by Elea Himmelsbach, Senior Consultant at the ODI and Certified Data Ethics Professional. So we're going to have a conversation today about key learnings for embedding data ethics in organizations. And I'm super excited. Elea and I work really closely together on consultancy projects around data ethics. So it's a really fun opportunity for us to talk about the reasons why different organizations take different approaches to this, and also take any questions from anyone who's here about, what might be the right approach for their organization. So we'll just give it another couple minutes for everybody to trickle in. If you want to introduce yourself in the chat and say hi, we'd love that. I see Laura already has. Hi, Laura. Welcome. Good to see you again. Laura is one of our data ethics professionals who gave a webinar recently. So we'd love to see who else is here. If you want to tell us sort of where you're coming, where you're joining us from today, or what sector you work in, that would be really interesting. Alea, how are you doing today?
I'm good. I'm good.
Alea is just back from India. When did you arrive? When did you set foot on British soil?
On Saturday evening, it's been
Oh
a
my,
long journey, 20 hours.
oh wow. I mean, if you made it, I suppose that's the key thing. The flights are going.
The flights are going
You're
direct.
not too jet lagged.
No, actually, we just stayed in British time. So 5.5 hours ahead in India. So and because they eat late, you can
Mm,
just keep British time alive
that works.
and fit in. Yeah.
Excellent. Welcome, everyone. For those of you that are just arriving, we'll get started in another minute. We just want to give people a chance to trickle in. If you've just arrived, please do introduce yourself in the chat. We'd love to see who's joining us today, what sector you work in, or your organization. Um, Always happy to see who's here. We usually get a pretty big range of people from public sector, private sector, all around the world. So it's always exciting for us to keep track. As we carry on with the webinar, any questions that you have, you can pop into the chat, or there is a separate Q&A box. So I'll keep an eye on those. And I think today, Alea and I were saying it might be fun to address the questions as we go through rather than wait until the end for a Q&A, if you're happy with that, Alea.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Let's keep it discursive.
Mm, brilliant. I'm just looking at who's introducing themselves in the chat. Hi, CCK. Hi, Anu. So looks like two sort of tech professionals here looking into sort of IT and AI governance. Welcome. Look forward to hearing any questions you have. We'll go on to the next slide. What time have we got? 3 minutes past. We'll get going. We've got a lot of content planned. Um, I just wanted to put the QR code on here really quickly for anyone to add if you like. We have a mailing list that sends out updates around when these webinars happen. So we do try and have them once a month. They're almost always delivered by an alumni of our data ethics professional course, so one of our certified data ethics professionals. Um, the slides and the recording for this session will be shared after the event, so this is going to be quite useful for any organizations that are trying to think of how they might like to tackle their data ethics journey. Maybe I should say embark on their data ethics journey. So you'll be able to look back on these slides and the recording if you want it. Oh, lovely to see more people introducing themselves in the chat. Hi, Angus. Hi, Kath. Great to see you. Okay, shall we get started, Alea?
Yes, let's get started.
Okay. I'll put this here.
So, hello everyone, and thank you for making time to listen to us. I'm very excited to be here. I've been working for the last 2 years very closely with Kay on helping organizations embed data ethics into their workflows. And today we thought it's kind of a good opportunity to introduce a bit of why organizations are thinking of embedding data ethics, how to think maybe about embedding data ethics, and then to kind of talk a bit about our data ethics courses, the tools we have developed as an organization over the years, our consultancy offers, and how those kind of things can be put together into something that you could adopt for yourself. So for those who don't know the ODI has been funded in 2012 by Sir Nigel Chabot and Tim Berners-Lee with a mission to create an open and trustworthy data ecosystems, because their vision was that if data should kind of work, data should work for everyone and not just for a few. Next slide, please. So underlying this is a kind of a theory of change, where trust is kind of the core component to lead towards a positive impact. So the belief in this theory of change is that if data is stewarded responsibly, it allows to create good and beneficial products and services that allow people to create insights that positively impact society. In this kind of scenario, we have two adverse scenario, the fearing where people kind of fear to share the data, often rightfully, because data are used and shared in less kind of cautious way. And the data hoarding scenario where monopolies hoard the data for their own profit. We think sharing data in a responsible way can lead to positive impact for everyone. Next slide, please. So data ethics has been part of our thinking very early on. And we look at it as a branch of ethics that allows to evaluate data practices with the potential to adversely impact people and society. So in kind of that there is a kind of a potential that if we do have bad data ethics practices, we have negative impacts through the collection of data, so the way we share it and the way we use the data. As you all know, there's a kind of nearly every week there are some stories in the news where in particular AI is flagged as a kind of a very kind of controversial agent in having negative impacts on society and individual. And I'm kind of just listing here a few kind of headlines to show why you as an organization may want to think to embed data ethics. So there is a kind of an app called the T app that was created to make it more safe for women to date, so they could register themselves in this app and then check if a date went kind of like if they met somebody they felt a bit worried about if there's any kind of previous history of violence or other kind of bad behavior. But the app went into disrepute because there was a massive data leak, which put a lot of women's safety into jeopardy. They also kind of did not really consider that if people register men as kind of potentially dangerous in a kind of an anecdotal way, that this could be also lead to misuse, that there kind of should kind of be more cautious kind of elements to kind of validate the facts. And there should be also an engagement to help kind of people who have been kind of accused of wrongful behavior to take recourse if something is wrong. So this app is an example of kind of the risk of privacy and safety of how this is kind of really needs to kind of be balanced. Another example from 2020 is kind of Toronto, which scrapped their smart data city approach because they did not really engage with the public when they wanted to regenerate their kind of riverside using surveillance. And there was a massive, massive public backlash where they said, like, we want to be informed. We want to know how our data is used. We want to know how surveillance happens and how it impacts us. So because they have not really kind of done the engagement part, they had to scrap this project. One that many of you in the UK may be familiar is the GCSE scandal. There was a project where Ofsted tried to kind of make more visible how well schools are performing in terms of the GCSE results. And they calculated the mean and have not considered that actually the mean can be skewed very quickly by removing outliers. And so they inadvertently incentivized schools to dispel outliers from schools. And that impacted in 2020 alone 61,000 pupils. And the scandal keeps on kind of having a negative impact on people's life until today. Another one is the Dutch children benefit scandal. So the Dutch government used this algorithm to identify potential benefit frauds. It's a practice that's often used in government to screen for fraud. But what went wrong here is that they didn't put a human in the loop. So they let the algorithm do the work, and the algorithm was biased and wrongfully accused many people of fraud, in particular minority communities. And this had a widespread impact and resulted in the resigning of a kind of a government official in the end. Another one is an example of where Google wanted to get it right. So they wanted to prevent being biased, but did not consider that history is not a uniform event. And so they put a kind of a bias kind of mask on it. And what it created was kind of Black Nazis, women Pope, kind of it kind of the kind of diversity kind of mask created kind of a kind of wrongful historic account. And then this is kind of more lukewarm news, but the kind of maybe the kind of the most recent one kind of we're listing here is this kind of dispute between the Pentagon and Anthropic, where it really was about like who can and should make data ethics decision. Is it the organization? Is it the kind of the one who kind of procures from the organization? So Anthropic did not want to permit Pentagon to use Claude for mass surveillance or for fully autonomous bombing. And the Pentagon took issue with this decision. So however, like here to say, like it's not all doom and gloom. I think like using AI responsibly with human oversight can also lead to positive impacts. So there are kind of also news that AI can improve cancer detections, for example, here in the UK for breast cancer screening, or AI can also help to save the ocean is another headlight. So like this is from a organization we have worked with for the last 2 years, who use surveillance data and machine learning to safeguard the ocean. And they have very kind of rigid kind of data ethics review processes in order to prevent misuse and really kind of be very sure that they communicate the caveats of their models. Over the years, we have developed different tools and resources, and I'm going to kind of introduce in the next few slides these resources. We have developed them at the individual level, so for individuals working in the organizations, in particular kind of training and resources. We have developed tools for projects where data ethics risks scale to review data ethics risks. And we have developed tools and processes for organizations in order to understand their maturity, to develop tools such as data ethics principles, to identify the way they want to kind of understand and review data ethics as an organization and how to embed data ethics into the workflow. So many of you who have done the training will have done some parts of that. So this is our training offer, and it has kind of three tiers. It has introductory offers that is really geared at kind of wider organizations and employees that kind of deal on day-to-day basis with data and need a level of awareness on how data ethics is important and how the way they collect and use the data has an impact to develop critical thinking. So this comes in two kind of tiers: a self-paced online courses and tutored and workshop-led discussions. We have observed if it's tutor-led and discussion-led, it has more uptake and it kind of can root in an organization better than if it's offered as a self-paced course, where it becomes often a kind of an afterthought after a busy workday. Then we have in-depth learning offers, and these are more geared towards those leading data ethics within an organization. Under this is also the data ethics professional training, of which many of you here in this seminar are alumni. And then the last tier is bespoke and tailored. So like some organizations may want to have very tailored courses to their needs. They want to have closed cohorts where they really can use the cohort to discuss their own organizational concerns in privacy within their kind of organizational boundaries.
If I could just add a little bit to this slide, Alea, one of the things that we've found over the years is that organizations often sort of pick off this slide like a menu. So they might choose to send a certain number of key staff on the data ethics professional training. They might book a few sessions or a number of sessions of introduction to data ethics and responsible AI to teach a larger number of people how to do assessments using the tools, because that one focuses mainly on sort of what is data ethics and how do you assess projects with tools. And a lot of organizations actually decide they want a more tailored approach, which they kind of build through membership. So when you get membership with the ODI, all of those things in that bespoke and tailored list, you get access for a certain number of staff to the self-paced learning on all those topics, which I know they're quite small, but I'm sure Joe would happily put the link in the chat. So all those different data ethics topics come as self-paced learning as part of membership for a certain number of staff. And then what many organizations will do is they'll ask, usually myself, to come and do a tutored session on those topics. So each one of those topics can be delivered in a tutored way. And so they might say something like, "Ooh, we'd like you to talk about sort of an intro to data ethics so that people learn to use the tools, but also can you include bias and fairness in data and AI and transparency and explainability?" And then I'll run a session based on that. And then the people that are chosen to come to that training can often signpost sort of the people under them on their teams to the self-paced learning if it's relevant. So these things tend to work really well in like a mixed approach. Okay, I will go on to the next slide. Thanks, Leah.
Thank you. So we have over the years developed a lot of different tools. And I just talk you through a few of them. So one of them is the consequence scanning, which actually has been developed by .everyone and has been taken over by the ODI. We have created a few years afterwards the consequence and risk evaluation tool, which is an online tool, which I'm going to talk through shortly afterwards. And then our oldest tool is the Data Ethics Canvas, a very kind of in-depth review process. So the consequence scanning tool is a kind of a tool that is designed as a kind of an agile method that can be embedded in any process when you start to design a product or service, to ask yourself three fundamental questions. The first one is, what are the intended and unintended consequences? So what is the kind of the positive impact of what you want to achieve with your project, and what may kind of be the kind of the causal kind of unintended, potentially negative impacts that could derive from the product and service. So, and then it kind of,
Sorry, I'll go back. Go back. There.
And then it kind of allows you to kind of to think about, so what are the kind of really positive elements you want to kind of frame and focus on, and what are the kind of consequences you want to mitigate and how you want to mitigate that. And this tool can be embedded at the beginning of the process, but then you can kind of incrementally, as you kind of develop the project further, you can kind of continue to do that. We offer that as a workshop. We have it also as a training offer, but it is a kind of an open source tool. You can go to our website. I'm sure Joe will also add a link to that, and you can do it yourself if that is of interest. It's very kind of agile and quite quick to do. Maybe important to mention, it is good to do it with a team, with a diverse team, in order to bring in different viewpoints and not kind of have a very kind of a tunnel vision on your projects because you know it well. And you may kind of just have a kind of a very kind of in-depth tech knowledge, but you may not kind of have a kind of a legal expertise, or you may kind of not have different kind of knowledge of communities that you try to reach with your product or service. Next one, please. So the CARE tool is a kind of a expansion of the consequence scanning tool. We have developed that, I think, in 2023 or 24. Correct me if I'm wrong, Kay.
2024.
2024. And principally what it does is to create a kind of a dedicated workflow around it. And then take the kind of the mitigation elements into a risk report, into a risk register, where you then can kind of start to kind of assign different people to deal with this risk and mitigate those risks. So it really kind of is designed to kind of make sure that it not kind of remains just a discussion, but it goes into an action, to an actual kind of mitigation workflow. It has a AI option to embed. It's at the moment kind of based on ChatGPT, where you can have an option to use that, to use the prompt to ensure that you kind of really ask yourself the right questions, to ensure that you have no blind spot. But here it's really important to caution you can't just use it as a kind of a truth for all, but it's a kind of a critical thinking tool, which you then kind of need to review, accept or expand or reject. And also it's important that you then kind of, if you choose this option, that you anonymize what you add to the tool. So you don't share things you don't want to share with ChatGPT.
One of the really interesting things too that we've seen when we've observed clients using this in consultancy projects is, the concern with having an AI suggest consequences is sort of like, oh, are people going to let the AI do the thinking for them? And actually, I would say it had the opposite effect because everybody who's in that consequence scan has that base level awareness of like, oh, we don't want to let an AI do the thinking for us. So they actually were very, very critical of anything the AI suggested. And it was almost like, um, I would say it was almost like an incentive to think even more critically about what was suggested. So it was like a brainstorming tool, but also a bit of an inspiration to think for themselves around like, what do I really want this to say and how do I want it to be said? So it actually works really nicely.
Yeah. And maybe to add, like this tool you can access over the membership as an individual, and we currently kind of starting to develop that as a product. So we started to customize that in where you can kind of have specific bespoke requests to customize the tool to your organizational needs. So if that is of interest, please kind of feel free to ask us question about that too.
So it can be sort of pre-trained with what the organizational principles are, what the key data ethics concerns are of the organization. It can be very, very bespoke. So something like that is really useful if you're wanting staff to do consequence scans. You want to make sure they're considering certain ethical angles, and you're concerned that not all staff may be at the same level in terms of anticipating what some of those consequences might be. Shall I go on to the next one now?
Please.
Okay, cool.
So this one is the Data Ethics Canvas. It's our oldest tool. It's a very kind of it's a very interesting tool. It has gone through many different iteration. It's very kind of in-depth assessment of a project. It has kind of four layers to it. It has the layers kind of where it asks questions around the data. So like it asks where the data is from, how it's collected, etc. The rights around the data sources, the limitations around it in the data sources, the kind of the ethical and legislative projects. So really kind of helping you to think from a very kind of foundational level on the kind of the impact that your data sources could have on data ethics. Then the second layer, the impact, is more or less kind of what you have in the consequence scanning, what I kind of just described in the last few slides. And then the third layer is the engagement. So if you think back to the Toronto example where they got this really, really horribly wrong to engage with people. So it asks the questions, how do you engage with people? How do you communicate the purpose of the projects? How open and transparent are you about how you do the work you're doing, of how you make decisions, how the data is used, how the data is collected, how the data is shared? It asks you questions around how you share the data with each other. And then the kind of the vertical blue kind of bubbles are the process. So it's a kind of about how you mitigate the adverse impacts of your practice. This is a very in-depth discussion-based canvas. We usually, as consultants, offer that as a workshop, 2 to 3 hours workshop, where we work with clients through one project. It can be also used, it's also kind of embedded in our learning resources. And again, it is kind of open source, so you can use it yourself and apply it to your projects. I sometimes use different bubbles when I start to think about the project because it's kind of just quite useful, and not all of the bubbles. It takes time. I would advise you to use it when you kind of really kind of need to think, kind of, you know that you do this project and you need to think it widely. You may want to engage another team to understand what you're doing. You want to kind of check the kind of the boundaries of the project, or you kind of work very closely with a client to collaboratively develop a project. That may kind of be also a very good kind of workshop to do together. But it's less a tool that you can do on a regular check, because it's quite time intensive and most organizations don't have these resources. It is maybe also good to mention translated in many different languages, including Dutch, French, Portuguese, Spanish, Italian, even Japanese. So if you kind of work across the world, this is maybe a tool you can use also in different contexts. And then, like, just to get to the end of the tools and looking at a more kind of organizational level assessment, then we have the maturity assessment tools. And I want just to pick out and talk a bit about the data ethics maturity model. If you go to the next slide. So the data ethics maturity model is a model to help you assess and benchmark how widely you have embedded data ethics practices across the entire organization. So it does not look just at a kind of a project level, but it looks at an organizational level as to how data ethics is embedded. So if you go to the next slide. So it assesses two kind of elements. It looks at the kind of the people aspects and thinks about the organizational governance and internal oversight mechanism, the skills and knowledge of data ethics that is available in the organizations, how you kind of or your team is engaging with stakeholders and the staff itself. And then from a policy and process perspective, it looks at the data management risk processes that you have in place, the funding and procurement processes, and the legal and compliance elements. It has 5 different levels of maturity. And often when we come to an organizations, we kind of find that there are either initial or repeatable steps. So the initial is like where there's no processes yet existence, but there may kind of be kind of some initial ad hoc kind of inconsistent applications. So maybe an individual or a team has started to pick up on some thinking. Or there are some kind of repeatable processes, but they're also kind of not yet quite consistent. There is no kind of consistent standard around it. And then if you can start to go into the define, that is often when you started to pick up data ethics thinking, is where you start to develop standards. You may have started to develop data ethics principles around which you start to build a criteria basis. And when you move into the managed states, you have really developed this framework. You have consistent review processes, escalation and pathways, mitigation and processes. And if you move and kind of choose to go into the optimized elements, then you kind of want to become a leader in your field. The maturity models are really kind of useful tools in order to kind of set a clear baseline and build a shared understanding. So many of you maybe are kind of a lone leader to and tasked with embedding data ethics in your organization, and you have to build a shared understanding and bring leadership on board. So the maturity assessment helps you to create assessments across the organization and kind of say like, we are here and we may kind of want to go to there. So you kind of then kind of see like where you are, you have a kind of a very kind of differentiated picture. You can start to prioritize certain elements that you find are very, very important to develop first, and then develop on the back of it a structured roadmap for progression. And then later on, you can kind of check if you have kind of really achieved the goals you have set yourself and kind of benchmark yourself as an organization against other organizations and compare your efforts. We recommend that you do this maturity assessment every year. And I think here I would say like it's quite useful to do that with an external consultant or kind of fellowship or something, but with an external one so that you avoid doing your own homework and you really have like an unbiased view across the organization. And the second thing I would mention is to assess across the organization. So assess the communication teams, the fundraising teams, the legal team, the tech teams to really have a kind of a widespread measure as to where you stand as an organization as a whole. And the last one, this is just an output of the tool. And it's worth to mention we have that also, we offer it as a tool over the membership offer. So you can also do it yourself if you so want to do so. In the next few slides, I'm gonna speak a bit about how we bring these things together in terms of bringing learning and consultancy together. So we speak sometimes as it as a consultancy offer, but really we should kind of speak it as a conjoined offer between learning and consultancy. Something that Kay and myself have been very passionate over the last 2 years to do so. We have put together here kind of a pathway, but we will see the next few slides. This is not a kind of a thing that is set in stone, but are maybe elements you want to kind of think about when you want to embed data ethics in your organization. We have found it very useful to start embedding data ethics by creating awareness across the organization to help all staff to onboard with the thinking. And that is kind of very easily done through training. And then in the next stage, it's useful to use the maturity assessment to kind of look, where are you? Take kind of make sure that you take leadership on board and follow up with training, dedicated training for leadership to make sure that they understand why data ethics should be a concern they should think about. And then in the follow-up step, it's useful to start to build your data ethics principles. So this is a kind of a way to really kind of bring the organizations together and think about what are the critical kind of principles that you want to think about in terms of data ethics and that you want to mark yourself against. And this is kind of it's a useful tool both for internal communication as well as external communication. So later on, you can also publish that to show to your clients how you kind of think about data ethics and how you kind of evaluate yourself against it. And then the fourth step is kind of starting to walk the walk. So it's about kind of embedding data ethics, creating pilot studies, developing the tools and review processes, the framework around it, and develop your internal leadership. So this is often where then the data ethics professional training kicks in, where organizations then develop their own resources to have their internal oversight. And then the fifth step is to iterate and expand. So test your methodology, communicate what you're doing with your stakeholders and the public, and to start to fundraise in order to sustain the efforts you have invested in.
So we've had a question in the chat, which I think is a really good one. So thanks, CCK, which is, do data ethics principles differ from organization to organization? And the short answer is yes, they're very different, and they are a really useful thing for an organization to stop and think about. Like, what do we actually want to do with our product or our services? And what are we going to try and prioritize when we come to these difficult decisions? So once the organization has these sort of spelled out from a leadership level, then when people are facing difficult decisions, when they're sort of developing projects, they can then sit there in their consequence scanning meeting with the project team, and when they're in a debate about like, but what about this possible negative, but what about this possible positive, and what should we do, then they can refer to those principles and be like, oh, well, one thing that will help us sort of decide what we're going to do is this is what the organization wants us to prioritize. I don't know if you have any sort of follow-up thoughts or comments on that, Leah.
No, it's kind of a way of creating a North Star, and a North Star that is kind of like the North Star of your organization. So there is no fit for all. Um, and maybe to kind of follow up is to kind of think about it's not something that needs to be done together with the organization. So if you do that with a consultancy, it's important to do it collaboratively and with the consultancy. So it should not kind of be brought in as this should be your principles, but it needs to come from within the organization.
Because I think one of the things that people sometimes want the ODI to do is like tell us what the right decision is. And actually, we can never do that because different organizations will have different viewpoints on what would be right for them and the service they want to offer. And so the types of things that might appear in principles, I don't know, maybe we could throw some examples out there, Leah, would be something like transparency around how we train our models or what we're doing with your data, or fairness. We're going to try and make sure that the benefits of our service are distributed fairly and equitably to all people, or maybe work collaboratively with communities, that sort of thing. Do you have any other sort of examples you could throw out there?
Equitable, I think
Mhm.
that's another word we
Mhm.
often have. And I guess like what is also useful to think with principle is that it's not just the words, but then that you kind of develop a bit of a guidance as to how different members of staff should unpack that. And
Mhm.
some organization may kind of choose then to kind of look like when you develop the pilot studies to kind of further kind of define of how this should kind of link to different projects or different departments.
Mm. So things like, okay, we've said we're going to be transparent. What does that actually mean in this project? And can we give any sort of little bullet points to staff when they are developing projects? What do we expect them to do so that they're transparent? Some actual concrete guidance. Yeah, really good question. Thanks for asking that. Right, carrying on.
So in the following few slides, we just give you some kind of case studies, if you want so, to just show of how different organizations have embedded data ethics in their organization. So if you kind of look at the kind of the pathway I presented before, this is a kind of a ideal pathway, but you may kind of opt to do that in different ways, depending on the size of the organization, the type of organizations you are, the budget you have available, the internal resources, not only from a kind of a financial, but also people and resources you have, as well as where data ethics emerges. Is it a kind of a grassroots kind of process, or does it come top down? So you may kind of opt different ways of embedding it, and we just show you different ways. Some clients of us have kind of used our services or our tools and training to do so. So the first one is an open environmental data for profit. We have worked with them over 2 years, and we have worked with them in a kind of a quite engaged way. We have delivered dedicated training for them, for all staff, as well as data ethics leaders and the leadership, and developed the data ethics maturity assessment for them, which has been very kind of fundamental for them to then kind of decide of how they want to embed data ethics and where they want to go within a specific time. We didn't develop with them as a consultancy like the data ethics principles. So we were this kind of neutral convener with their data ethics squad to help them think through about data ethics principles, and then to help them embed data ethics into workflows. So we have then together with them developed some pilot studies and then developed a data ethics manual. We have been there like for them the kind of the core delivery partner. So they had a data ethics lead in the organizations, but they didn't have a lot of resources. So they used us as a kind of a neutral convener, as well as a kind of a body to really produce the bulk of the kind of the framework in communication with them and to hold them onto account. So it's not a kind of an afterthought, but they really had to commit to what they committed to. And then we developed bespoke tools for them. So we created a kind of a triage tool for them before care in order that all projects can be lightweightedly screened, and then only a kind of the risk or high risk projects were kind of going through further reviews. And they're now kind of even developing a very bespoke care tool version that fits to their organizational lead. We have also done some data ethics professional training, so they have internal leadership. And at this last stage, also kind of developed a logic model to help them from this initial kind of framework to kind of take that into the next step, to think about how do they communicate their efforts, how do they kind of start to fundraise, how do they onboard the wider organizations onto this framework.
So it's probably worth mentioning this is our friends Global Fishing Watch, which they did a webinar last month explaining sort of how they embarked on this journey and how they carried it out. If you want more details, I'm sure that Joe will happily share the link to the page where their webinar is recorded and you can find out more about it. They took a very, I'd say, consultancy heavy approach to this because they had funding from a philanthropic donor who wanted them to do this. This was important for that donor and for the organization itself. And so, that like having it be consultancy heavy, obviously, like they're paying for our time to do that. But then they're also that like massively increases the capacity of the organization rather than trying to get people who already have a day job to like add extra to their job, if you know what I mean. They've now moved to a more sort of tools heavy approach because now the care tools embedded in like every project they do gets a data ethics assessment, at least initially, and then channeled more towards the care tool if it needs a more in-depth assessment. And so they're getting that bespoke version of the care tool that incorporates their principles. We had a question that popped in the chat from Anu, which I think is a really good question. Have you ever faced the dilemma of when leaders and your views differ on the associated risks of using an AI system? I think what I have seen actually is leaders and staff in the same organization having different views about that because often leaders tend to just take a very strategic approach around like what's our commercial risk, what's our reputational risk. They're thinking of it in a very risk-based way, and the people who are on the ground are thinking more specifically about that project in general, has been my observation. But that's where obviously having these discussions like the consequence scanning where everybody's in a room discussing what could happen is really valuable. What's your thought on that, Alea?
Yes, I think also kind of having a very clear escalation pathway. Um, so having this discussion means like different viewpoints can be heard. And this is not only important to flag data ethics risk, but it also means like that the employee base can be heard by leadership. And it's also for leadership an opportunity to share their view and their kind of decision-making process with the employee base. Now, this does not kind of get rid of the dilemma or the conflict, but there is at least accountability on how decisions are made and what the pathway of the decisions are made.
Mm. Because I think in terms of risk for an organization, probably, I mean, I may be idealizing it a little bit here, but I think it buys a lot of trust if you, as an organization, are like, okay, we had a contentious decision to make. We've made this decision for this reasons. These are why we've done it. Um, yes, there may be this risk, but we've tried to mitigate it in this way, and these are the benefits we're hoping to achieve with this project. Like, I think that buys more trust than just never addressing it at all. So having these discussions openly and then having a way to sort of document that they've happened is really valuable, even if the decision isn't like it's impossible to make everybody happy with every decision. So even if the decision isn't making everybody happy, at least that clear documentation of why and hopefully a clear link to the principles that the organization has set out mean that people can see, oh, okay, they have this main aim, this principle that they want to do this, and that's why they've made that decision. Shall I show the next one?
Yes, please.
Okay, here we go.
So this one is a very different organizations. It's a large central government agency. So they you can see they have not to do any consultancy, but they invested heavily on in training. So they have a we have a kind of the government campus is a kind of a set procurement and pathway where it's very easy for them to procure training without having to source additional funding for data ethics. And so they invested in training and really kind of focused very heavily on training on tools and then had their own internal kind of resources to develop their own data ethics framework internally. So they didn't need this kind of additional kind of resources from an external agency, but they wanted to have the training in order to kind of be aware of what they need to think about and could think about when developing their framework.
One of the things I'd add here too is each cohort of data ethics professional is 16 people. So they ended up having a lot of people in the virtual room, if you like, that were from different teams. And it really broke down a lot of the silos around how are we going to make sure that this project is assessed ethically, like across the entire organization. So I think that alone like really helps boost maturity when you actually have communication about data ethics across different teams. So that's been super valuable for them. All right, next slide.
And then we have another kind of smaller organization, or not a kind of a large government organization. They have yet again kind of used a different process. They worked prior to engaging with us with another consultancy to kind of develop their principle and the roadmap. And then they came to us for training. So they invested very heavily in monthly training for the entire organization and had two key staff complete the data ethics professional. From an implementation perspective, they really kind of made sure that they had dedicated internal resources that have enough time, I think 2 to 3 days a week to kind of kind of develop the framework, embed data ethics into the organization. And so they kind of did this entire work we have done with the Global Fishing Watch as a consultancy. They did that in-house because they kind of made sure that they have the internal resources, and they used us just to kind of develop the training for their kind of internal staffing.
So this is a shout out to our friends at Amy. This is them. So Joe can share the link there to the webinar that they did last February, I believe, where they talked about this. Now they asked that because they did develop those data ethics frameworks and prefer to sort of keep those confidential for their organization, they've just shared the recording of their Q&A. But it'll be interesting if anybody wants to hear the Q&A that followed that presentation. That was really interesting. One of the things I want to emphasize here is they really invested in that data ethics lead's time. She was a senior principal data scientist, I believe, and actually, her time, because she was senior enough to have the clout, she was able to develop those frameworks internally. I think that by asking internal staff to do that work. That's one way that organizations often will try and do it to a tighter budget. The one thing I would just say is, if you want it done right internally, it needs to be someone who is given that time and who does have the clout to actually make it happen. Because if you're just adding it on top of what's already a full-time job, that's a lot harder to accomplish. Should I go to the next one? It's our last one.
The last one is another central government department. They have done a bit similar to what Global Fishing have done. They have procured consultancy service, so they have the maturity assessments. They develop with us their data ethics principles, and then they kind of asked us to do a light touch data triage process and escalation pathways. Again, they invested quite a bit into training. So they had the introduction to data ethics into the department so that everybody had training material to help them roll out the data ethics framework. And they had 5 staff members take the data ethics professional training. So again, they kind of made sure that they have internal leaders able to kind of lead a wider organization to adopt data ethics pathways. As tools, they use the data ethics canvas and consequence scanning. And then they kind of created a kind of a bespoke training alongside the triage process. So they adapted again the resources very slightly.
Mhm.
But it was less involved with us. So once they had their internal resources, they took it further internally. There is no right or wrong way to adopt. So there's different criteria. But what I would say and echo is what Kay said earlier. It is important that whoever is tasked to embed data ethics in an organization has the resources in terms of time, um, money, and the authority to get the wider organization on board. So it's really important that leadership is buying in and the person has the leadership support to then um, make different projects and team embed data ethics into the processes. And this is a quite a complex task, and it's useful to think as in terms of change management. It's a
Mhm.
change to processes. It changes how people need to review it, how people need to invest in the processes, and not all teams may be happy with it. So we often hear, for example, from tech teams that it's so heavy, it takes so much time, it's it stems in innovations. But we also hear it actually helps to think early on about consequences in a useful way. So it helps to structure also thought processes in a very productive way.
And certainly prevents having to go back and fix things later or scrap projects that have already been invested in, if they haven't been thought about in advance. So I think that brings us to the end of that. We've got a little bit of time for Q&A. So if anybody wants to ask any further questions, really enjoyed the questions that have been in the chat so far. Feel free to type those in now. We'll have a bit of discussion about those. We've got maybe 3 or 4 minutes if anyone's got one last question. I think one thing that I wanted to comment on, excuse me, in terms of these different approaches that the organization did, not every organization has the funding to, you know, have sort of a really, really comprehensive amount of consultancy support. But I think one of the things that we can do at the ODI is try and tailor it to what the organization can do. So, for example, just looking at this last case study where it says we provided them with bespoke training materials. One of the things that we can do is if they've already got an internal data ethics framework, like some of the other organizations we profiled have done, we can build some training for rolling it out across the wider team that doesn't just focus on our tools, but focuses on the frameworks that they've developed that are really bespoke to their organization and include sort of sector specific case studies that really highlight the relevance of data ethics to individual team members and like why it matters to them. And one of the other things I want to add as well is that the executive leadership training that we've offered that can be quite bespoke is really useful because it's short. Obviously, leaders don't have a lot of time, so we can deliver a sort of data ethics training in like 45 minutes that just highlights to leaders why this matters without any of the nitty-gritty about how it needs to be accomplished. Ooh, we've got a question here from Philippa. Is there a specific sector that has taken on implementing data ethics more than others? Has AI driven the adoption of data ethics? It's a really interesting question. There's like two questions. Let's start with, has AI driven the adoption of data ethics? I certainly hear more about it since AI has become a big concern. And I think, some of the headlines that Alea showed at the beginning, like the one around the sort of school metrics, that doesn't really involve AI at all, but obviously still needs an ethical assessment around data. But I think that because AI sort of scaled up the rapidity with which things can go wrong. It's a lot of times it's the same kinds of problems, but they just happen much more rapidly and maybe with less human oversight. That's got people more worried. Maybe it's driven the conversation a little more. What do you think, Alea?
Yeah, maybe it's more visible, but I think the concerns were there before.
Mm.
Um, yeah, I, I wouldn't know. I wouldn't know. Something to look into. I think definitely like projects where like, for example, kind of privacy, security, surveillance, health, there are different things like I guess also even before AI has had a lot of limelight and attention to get those things right.
Mm. And I want to address Philippa's other question as well. Is there a specific sector that's taken on implementing data ethics more than others? That's a really good question. I mean, I think regulation really drives a lot of this. So ones that are regulated, um, we see a lot of concern around this. I see a lot of concern in government because people are obviously, they've got guidance from central government around data ethics that they care about. But also, I think the sort of like charitable and nonprofit sector, I see a lot of concern there about it. What do you think, Alea?
Yeah, I would echo that. I would echo that.
I think that, in terms of the clients that we have contacting us, we really see it from all sectors, which is nice. It's reassuring to think that people are interested in this stuff from everything from, environmental, healthcare, banking, um, lots of government agencies. Like we see so much. Lots of private companies send individuals on data ethics professionals, which is nice. So, um, well, I see we've just got one last question from Joanna. We've just got time. I work for government, run a young people survey that gets asked to over 5,000 young people. We used to have an ethics committee, but we've lost that resource. Could these tools be used to review the questions being asked from an ethical standpoint? I think they could, Joanna. I would definitely, I would have a look at the data ethics canvas because I think probably a lot of the questions in there would be really helpful. The one thing I would say is try and have people, I think the different colors of bubbles need to be answered by different people. So, for example, could your data have bias in it? That's something that probably someone with some data expertise needs to answer. Whereas engaging with young people is probably a different person who would be good at answering the questions in that green bubble. So I would definitely think about the data ethics canvas as a project team and think about who might be best positioned to try and answer some of those questions. And I think they would be really good sort of prompting questions for that. Do you have any thoughts on that, Alea?
Yes, use the canvas, and maybe to add to that, like much of our tools are open, so have a look at it and then kind
Mm,
of pick things together. So it's sometimes not only kind of the kind of designed pathway that is useful, but sometimes you can kind of pick elements that are valid to the specific questions you have.
mm, absolutely. Um, so we are just about out of time. I just want to give a shout out to next month's Data Ethics Professionals webinar. It is from Police Scotland. They are going to talk about how they built an ethical data culture. They have developed a really, really wonderful data ethics framework that's very tailored to the police context. So I thought it was great. I'm sure they'll be talking about how they developed that framework and also how they implement it. So should be a really interesting session. So please do book on if you want to come and talk to us on the 29th of April. So that brings us to an end. Thank you so much for all the excellent questions. Thank you, Alea, for all this insight into all the consultancy operations. Always wonderful to have a chat with you. And hopefully we'll see you all next month.